Archibald Dalzell was a British colonial administrator and slave trader who served as the governor of the Gold Coast portion of West Africa from 1792 to 1802. He had been born in Scotland and trained to be a doctor in Edinburgh. After serving in the Royal Navy, he took employment on Africa's west coast, initially as a surgeon, and then later as a trader. Towards the latter end of his life, he owned 2 slave ships. Dalzell described the Dahomey government as perhaps the most perfect despotism on the face of the earth. Even the prime minister of the country was required to show the king the most abject prostration and submission as the lowest slave. It was the king's right to dispose of any of his subjects and their property at his own pleasure or discretion. None but the highest-ranking officers were allowed to communicate directly with the king. Speaking with anyone else, the king felt, was beneath his dignity. Within the walls of the different royal palaces in Dahomey were no less than 3,000 women belonging to the king, several hundred or more being Amazons in the Dahomey army. There were several of these palaces, each one occupying approximately a square mile. In the middle of each side of the palaces were guardhouses, the roofs of which were ornamented with human skulls on wooden stakes. Dalzell once visited the Dahomey king Bosser Hadi in his bedchamber when he was ill. In front of the bedchamber was a 3-foot wall stuck full of human jawbones, while the path leading to its door was paved with human skulls. The origin of the Dahomey kingdom can be traced back to Tekudunu, the chief of the Fois, or the Foi people, making an imperialistic attack on Dahomey. His initial attempts at conquering Dahomey were thwarted by its prince at the time, a man by the name of Da. Angry and frustrated with his failure, Tekudunu vowed that when and if he was successful in taking Dahomey, that he would sacrifice Da to his deity, or fetish. Victory finally came for Tekudunu, and he had a large palace built for himself in Dahomey in honor of his imperialistic success. True to his word, he ripped open the stomach, or belly, of the captive Prince Da, displaying the eviscerated corpse on the foundation of his new palace. When the palace's construction was completed, Tekudunu christened it with the name Dahomey, meaning the house in Da's belly. This conquest of Dahomey occurred around the year 1625. From thenceforward, the Fois became known as the Dahomeys, and Tekudunu the first king of the Dahomey Empire, or kingdom. A particular incident under the reign of the Dahomey king Trudeau furnishes insight into the level of barbarity practiced by the Dahomeys. When Ardra was conquered, POWs, who through age, wounds, or infirmities were unable to march, had been ordered to be executed on the spot. This task was assigned to some young boys who were traveling with the army in order to become inured to hardships and be trained in the art of war. They were given swords and told to cut off the captives' heads. Some of the boys were only 7 to 8 years old, and barely able to wield the swords they were given. This led to incredible pain and suffering on the part of the condemned POWs, these boys continuously hacking away at their necks and heads. POWs taken in the Dahomey Wars, which were essentially slave raids, were either kept as slaves by the king, and/or by those he permitted to have slaves. When no slaves were desired, or when all POWs of use or value had already been obtained, the remainder were used for human sacrifices at the Dahomey's customs. Other times they were sold as slaves to European and native slave traders who would take them far from Dahomey territory. Dalzell, through his long residence and intimate relationships and knowledge of African natives, the Dahomeys in particular, corrected the mistake made by some Europeans who wrote and or claimed that the wars of Africans were waged on the motive of obtaining slaves to sell to Europeans. The Dahomey kingdom had been engaged in wars with its neighbors for approximately 70 years before ever selling a slave to a European. A war, or slave raid, the Dahomeys waged against the Mahis, or Mahi people, furnishes another example of insight into the savagery of the Dahomeys and their king at the time, Adahunzu. In this war, men, women, and even children were all indiscriminately put to the sword. With the desire to strike further terror into the Mahis, after being decapitated, the bodies of the slain, children included, were hung up in the trees throughout the stage of war in the Mahi country. The decapitated heads were brought to the king, who gave an amount of cowries, currency used at the time, for each bloody head. "For it is heads that I want, not slaves," said King Adahunzu. More astonishing savagery was enacted under Adahunzu when the Prince of Sarachi was brought in as a captive after another of Dahomey's plethora of slave raids. It just so happened to be the day preceding the Dahomey customs. The populace insulted and abused this prince at the front of the king's gate where he was placed. 4 days later, he was tied up like a hog, placed in one of the ceremonial baskets used for sacrifices, and tossed from the stage, a structure high enough to cause death upon reaching the ground. He was then decapitated, and the Dahomey rabble scrambled for his head, the eventual possessor of the head devouring it. After the Dahomeys conquered Badagry, the king ordered that the skulls of the sacrificed were to be used to decorate his palace walls. The person in charge of this barbarous work miscalculated, or misjudged the spacing of the skulls, placing them too close together, rendering him unable to adorn the entire palace. He requested that he be allowed to start the work over so that he could properly space things out, but the king declined, telling him that more of the Badagry POWs would be sacrificed in order to supply the deficit. 127 more skulls were needed. Badagry natives were dragged out of the prison where they were being kept, and were murdered in cold blood for their skulls, a round of applause then following from all Dahomeys present. Kings prior to Adahunzu saw the practice of trade, or commerce, as ignoble, relegating it to their cabasirs. They valued war, slave raids, conquest, and sacrificing people to their ancestors and gods. Having been unsuccessful in war during a period of his reign, Adahunzu decided to monopolize the slave trade as a power tactic. The motive was to keep as much wealth out of the hands of the neighboring Mahis and Nagos as he could. This attempted action on Adahunzu's part ended up negatively affecting the commerce and economy of Dahomey. He desperately then started having parties lie in ambush to attack and rob traveling slave traders of their slaves. Lyon Labson Esquire was the British governor at Whydah in the 1790s when this history was written. He had lived on the west coast since the 1770s, and was part of the colonial government there for 20 years. He was also very familiar with the native people and their languages. In the following quote from Dalzell, he describes a conversation between Adahunzu and Governor Abson on the slave trade, and the arguments being made for and against it at the time in England. Quote, Governor Abson, having taken an opportunity of communicating to Adahunzu some of the particulars respecting the slave trade, which had become the subject of conversation and parliamentary inquiry in this country, and having carried with him some of the pamphlets for and against the abolition of that traffic, which he read to him in Adahunzu's native language, the king listened with great attention, and though business several times broke in upon the narration, still requested Mr. Abson, after every interruption, to proceed. When the whole was finished, the king spoke as follows: I admire the reasoning of the white men, but with all their sense, it does not appear that they have thoroughly studied the nature of the blacks, whose disposition differs as much from that of the whites as their color. The same great being formed both, and since it has seemed convenient for him to distinguish mankind by opposite complexions, it is a fair conclusion to presume that there may be as great a disagreement in the qualities of their minds. Your countrymen who allege that we go to war for the purpose of supplying your ships with slaves are grossly mistaken. You think you can work a reformation, as you call it, in the manners of the blacks, but you ought to consider the disproportion between the magnitude of the two countries, and then you would soon be convinced of the difficulties that must be surmounted to change the system of such a vast country as this. We know you are a brave people, and that you might bring over a great many of the blacks to your opinions by the points of your bayonets, but to effect this a great many must be put to death, and numerous cruelties must be committed, which we do not find to have been the practice of the whites. Besides, that this would militate against the very principle which is professed by those who wish to bring about a reformation. In the name of my ancestors and myself, I aver that no Dahomey man ever embarked in war merely for the sake of procuring wherewithal to purchase your commodities. I, who have not been long master of this country, have, without thinking of the market, killed many thousands, and I shall kill many thousands more. When policy or justice requires that men be put to death, neither silk, nor coral, nor brandy, nor cowries, can be accepted as substitutes for the blood that ought to be spilt for example's sake. Besides, if white men choose to remain at home and no longer visit this country for the same purpose that has usually brought them hither, will black men cease to make war? I answer, by no means. And if there be no ships to receive their captives, what will become of them? I answer for you. They will be put to death. Perhaps you may ask, how will the blacks be furnished with guns and powder? I reply by another question. Had we not clubs, and bows, and arrows, before we knew white men? We do indeed sell to the white men a part of our prisoners, and we have a right so to do. Are not all prisoners at the disposal of their captors? And are we to blame if we send delinquents to a far country? I have been told you do the same. You have seen me kill many men at the customs, and you have often observed delinquents at Grigui, and others of my provinces, tied and sent up to me. I kill them, but do I ever insist on being paid for them? Some heads I order to be placed at my door, others to be strewed about the marketplace, that people may stumble upon them when they little expect such a sight. This gives a grandeur to my customs far beyond the display of fine things which I buy. This makes my enemies fear me, and gives me such a name in the bush. I now tell you that you may hear and know, and inform your countrymen, why customs are made, and will be made, as long as black men continue to possess their own country. The few that can be spared from this necessary celebration we sell to the white men. And happy, no doubt, are such, when they find themselves on the path for Grigui, to be disposed of to the Europeans. We shall still drink water, say they to themselves. White men will not kill us, and we may even avoid punishment by serving our new masters with fidelity. End quote. In the following, Dalzell quotes from Governor Abson, where the cruel character of King Adahunzu and the Dahomey people is put on display. Quote, the commencement of the customs being arrived, the half-heads, or fetish priests, were dispatched to invite the European governors to witness the ceremony. On their arrival at Dahomey, they found Adahunzu in his palace, seated amidst 400 of his women, all very richly dressed. Observing at a little distance 6 women on their knees, with despair painted in their countenances, the white men who were present shuddered with apprehension for the miserable victims, and anticipated a scene big with horror, but inferior in barbarity to that which was about to be realized. The monster Adahunzu desired that a bundle might be brought, which untying it with his own hands, he presented the contents, 5 cutlasses, to 5 of his fat and overgrown women, and having ordered the 6 kneeling females to be placed before him, he made a speech to the following purport. These women were brought from Api by my army. I took them home, domesticated them in my family, treated them as my wives, but not content, they made their escape to their native country, where, however, they found nothing but the ground and the trees, for everything else had been destroyed by my troops. They afterwards surrendered themselves to the king of Ardra, but he was too just to keep them, and has therefore sent them back to me to receive the proper reward for their ingratitude. This woman, clapping his hand on the head of one of them who suckled a child, is a relation of the king of Ardra. But remember that it is not her respectable ancestry that prevents her from sharing the same fate with the rest. No, her infant saves her for a while, but she must shortly pass out at the same door with her companions. Having concluded this truly savage harangue, the woman and child were put aside, and the 5 other victims were conducted to the spot where men, horses, and bullocks are usually sacrificed for the customs. There, being ordered to kneel, with their faces touching the ground, the women who held the cutlasses began to put in execution their infernal commission in a manner too shocking for description. One of the unhappy wretches was quickly delivered from her misery, her head being severed from her body at 4 strokes. The sufferings of the rest, from the awkwardness of the executioners, was protracted for 20 minutes, the king standing over and instructing them. Not that way, hold your cutlass thus, give it me, so, imagine you are chopping wood. Thus did the hellish monster direct the ministers of his cruelty to cut off heads with as much apathy as if indeed he had been chopping wood, while the air was rent with the shouts of his grandees calling over his strong names, and bursting into such peals of laughter, that a distant witness of this horrid ceremony would have been led to believe that some very diverting scene was exhibiting. The sufferers were all very comely, well-made women, and it is very remarkable that not a groan was heard from any of them during their execution. Many of the AP prisoners suffered the same fate, few being carried to market. Indeed, this wretch more than once has been known to put to death many hundreds of his captive enemies, without reserving a single slave for sale, or even for the payment of his debts. In a final quote from Dalzell, the human sacrifice and slavery practices in 1791, under the Dahomey king Wenuhu, are touched upon. Quote, in the months of January, February, and March, the solemnization of the grand customs, and of the king's coronation took place, the ceremonies of which lasted the whole 3 months, and were marked almost every day with human blood. Captain Farrer, and particularly Mr. Hogg, governor of Apollonia, were present. Both affirm that not less than 500 men, women, and children fell as victims to revenge and ostentation under the show of piety. Many more were expected to fall, but a sudden demand for slaves having thrown the lure of avarice before the king, he, like his ancestors, showed he was not insensible to its temptation.
End quote.